my PowerPoint show up here on income inequality. So to begin with, I want to make a distinction between income and wealth. Income and wealth. These are the two major ways that we think about inequality in our society. And it's the two ways that most researchers try to measure it. And so if we begin with income, let's think about what is income and how is it different from wealth. Income is basically what people earn from work. So what you make in a year in terms of your salary or your wage, that is your income. Pretty straightforward. Wealth, on the other hand, is the value of everything a person or a family owns. So wealth includes a lot more. Wealth includes, for example, your house. If you own a house, that's part of your wealth. If your house is worth $200,000 and you paid it off, that's part of your wealth. It will also include other things, investments in the stock market, for example, investment in bonds, investment in other kinds of real estate. So it's a very important distinction. So a couple of philosophical questions for us to think about as we continue here. One is there economic inequality in our society? Now, if we were meeting face to face here, I'm sure most of you, all of you would be shaking your head. Yes, of course, there's inequality in our society. Another question that I have here is, what are some ways that we can observe it? What are some ways that we can observe it? Well, we'll be able to observe it as we go through this lecture, my lecture on poverty. We can measure it by we can measure and observe it by looking at statistics on wealth and income. I think we can also see it in our everyday lives. This is sometimes a good question for class discussion. We can think of, for example, how did you see, what kind of signs were present of inequality when you drove to campus or when you drive to work or in your everyday life? And you can see it in some ways in terms of the quality of neighborhoods that people live in, the size of the houses, so it's observable in that way. If you drive through Beverly Hills, for example, that's one kind of extreme way in our area, at least, that you can physically actually see inequality. But the most important question here is that, should there be inequality? And if so, how much? So while you're probably shaking your head to the first question and the affirmative, of course, there's some inequality in our society. We can see it. Should there be? Should there be inequality? And if so, how much? Should everybody be the same? Should everybody make the same wage or salary? Should everybody own the same amount of wealth? So, for example, we should all own a house of equal value. This is an important question. It might at first seem like, of course there should be some inequality, but I think we'd probably agree there should be some inequality. But the challenging one is, if so, how much? One important argument that economists make for justifying the way things are, in other words, for saying that inequality in our society is good, even extreme inequality, because it serves as an incentive for people to work hard. If we all made the same, then where would be the incentive to excel, to improve, to innovate, to become better, to work hard? Um, and there's a lot of merit to that argument. But then the second part of this question here, if so, how much inequality? How much inequality do you need to serve as an incentive for people to work hard? So I want to talk about a really interesting study that was done by these two researchers from Harvard University a few years ago. And it was published in this journal here, Perspectives on Psychological Science. And it's a study that's gotten a lot of attention, and it's a really compelling one. And what they did was they wanted to know, um, they wanted to see on average, take the average person in the United States, how much inequality in our society do they think that we have? And then they wanted to ask them, how much inequality should there be? So again, they were interested in getting the perspective of the average person and asking them, you know, how much inequality in our society do you think there really is? You know, how many poor, how many rich? And then they also asked them, okay, what do you think it should be? Should everybody be equal? How should it be distributed? And in their survey, it was several thousand people. They selected their sample of people in such a way that it represented what they call a cross section of American society. It represented people by income, it represented people by both political parties, it represented people by different geographic areas in the United States. So essentially, you know, researchers, if they do it right, they can choose a sample of people from the United States to survey that will give you a representation of everybody. So it's not biased. So it's not like, okay, they just interviewed very liberal people. And of course, liberal people are going to tend to advocate for more income and wealth equality. And so the statistics they have, which we'll look at in a second, are kind of the average view of everybody, both conservatives, liberals, and so on. Now, an important piece of information as background to this study is that one of the most common ways that researchers measure income inequality and wealth inequality is by dividing society into fifths or quantiles. Now, this is going to be a little bit confusing and maybe hard to get your mind around. Don't worry about it too much. I think it will become clearer as we go through this lecture. But they use this kind of thing here. You have a bottom fifth, the second fifth, the middle fifth, fourth fifth, the top fifth. And if all income or wealth, depending on what you're measuring here, and again, the Norton and O'Reilly study was looking at wealth inequality. But if all families had the same wealth, you have 5 equal groups from poorest to richest. So each group represents 20% of the population. So you have 5 groups, and each represents 20% of the population. That adds up to 100%. So if there were perfect equality, then 20% of the families should earn 20% of the income or wealth, 40% should earn 40%, and so on. So I know this probably is very confusing right now. So let's bear with me here. Let's go to the next PowerPoint slide. So if you had perfect wealth equality, this is what that distribution would look like. You've got the bottom fifth of society. They have 20% of the wealth. Take the second fifth, there's 20% more, and so on. So wealth is spread out evenly. This is perfect equality. This would be socialism. This would be, everybody has the same amount of stuff. So now hopefully it kind of makes sense here. Now, in the survey done by those Harvard researchers, they asked all of these people, what do you believe the distribution of wealth in the United States should be? What do you think it should be? Because virtually no one really advocates for complete equality. I think the average person sees that as not practical and probably wouldn't be a good idea. But okay, well, what do you think the distribution of wealth then should be? How much inequality should there be? And okay, so that was the question that they asked, and I'll show you in a minute what the results were. And then they asked them, what do you think the distribution of wealth in the United States is? So now you can take a moment and think about this for a minute. How would you fill in these boxes here? If asked, what do you believe the distribution of wealth in the United States should be? Do you think that if you take, for example, on the left-hand side, the bottom fifth, the left-hand side as you're looking at the PowerPoint, if the bottom fifth, should they have 1% of the wealth, 2%, 30%, 50%? And what about those folks at the very top? How much of wealth should they have? And then the next box here, what do you think the distribution of wealth in the United States actually is? What do you think the distribution of wealth in the United States actually is? And so I would encourage you to pause the lecture at this point and see if you can fill in these boxes. See what you come up with. If nothing else, fill in the top fifth and the bottom fifth. So I'm going to go ahead and continue now, but if you pause it, it would be fun to see what you come up with. So in that study, we found that most Americans think the distribution of wealth in the United States looks like this. This is kind of interesting. Most people, again, conservative, liberal, people from different walks of life, tended to think that the bottom fifth in our society has 3% of the wealth. And then you kind of can look at the numbers here and work your way up to the top 5%. They have 58% of the wealth. I find it most helpful when I look at these numbers here to focus on the bottom fifth and the top fifth. Um, so this is what they think it is. I'm sorry, this is what most people think this is what it is. Okay, now the second question, um, what do you think the distribution of wealth should be? And this is what the average person said. So this is really interesting. Um, most people think that there's more inequality than there should be. And most think that there should be some inequality and that a picture like this would be a fair representation of what American society should economically look like. So if we focus again on the bottom fifth and top fifth, the bottom fifth has 12% of the wealth. The top fifth has 32% of the wealth. So pretty interesting. Now this is the killer. What the distribution of wealth in our society actually is. So again, we can focus on the two right sides. The left side, the bottom fifth, in reality has 0.1% of the wealth in our society. The top fifth has 84%. So again, I find it helpful to focus on the two sides here, the bottom fifth and the top fifth. And let's look at the bottom fifth here. Most Americans think the bottom fifth, that's about 3% of the wealth. They think they should have about 12% of the wealth. And the reality is the bottom fifth has 0.1% of the wealth. So it's interesting that a lot of people, I would not have guessed. I would have guessed more like 3% to 5% myself. So that's very interesting. And we go on the right-hand side. Most people thought that the top fifth had 58% of the wealth. They thought that they should have 32% of the wealth, whereas in fact they have 84% of the wealth. Now there's a really great YouTube video that somebody put together that summarizes the argument made by, or the survey, the study done by those two researchers from Harvard. And it's just a couple minutes long. I'm going to try to play it for you here. Let's see. Okay. For some reason, I couldn't get the YouTube video on this screen for some reason, but there is a link to it on Canvas for this week. I think the link is called Video Clip on Wealth Inequality. And this is what it will take you to. So if you want to pause the audio recording here and go to that link, it's only about 4 or 5 minutes. It's a very good video. So I'm going to kind of continue here. And so after watching that video, I hope you have I think it gives a really good overview and a clear illustration of the survey that was conducted by those two Harvard researchers and what they found and how powerful their findings were. So it's really just almost shocking when we look at how skewed the distribution of wealth in our society is. Here's another way to think about it. If you took the landmass of the United States and divided it up and did a representation of how much land would represent how much wealth and how it's distributed, this is what you would get. The top 1% would own just about half of the United States. And if we go down to this red dot here, 40% would own this red dot. So it's really an extreme division of wealth. Every year, Forbes magazine puts out a issue that looks at the top richest Americans. And this is I think the most recent, this is 2017. I don't think it's changed much since then, but you can look at the vast wealth that the top 10 richest people in our society have. Jeff Bezos of Amazon, 160 billion. Bill Gates, 97 billion. Warren Buffett, 88.3 billion. Mark Zuckerberg, 61 billion, and so on. So just a handful of individuals and families own more wealth than 30-40% of Americans. I mentioned earlier that wealth includes other things in addition to income. And here's an example of that. If you looked on your left-hand side, wealth includes stocks and mutual funds, financial securities, trusts, business equity, non-home real estate. It includes some other things too. It includes it includes houses or homes. Non-home real estate refers to commercial real estate. But there's just a vast amount of wealth out there that's invested in these different areas. And when we look at wealth inequality, we can break down wealth inequality looking at these various types of wealth. So, for example, with stocks and mutual funds, the top 1% own just about half of all stock and mutual funds. And that's a significant amount. The top 10% own just about 90% of stocks and funds. The bottom 90% own just about 10% of stocks and funds. So you can go through and look at that with financial securities, trusts, business equity, and so on. You'll see a name at the end, at the bottom of this table, Edward Wolf. He's a sociologist, or part sociologist, part economist, who's one of the leading researchers on wealth inequality in the United States. If you're interested, you could look him up and get more information. And so finally, take a look at this clip by John Oliver on his comedy show Last Week Tonight. It's a clip about income and wealth inequality, and it's pretty funny, but it helps to get at the reality of some of the inequality in our society. So you can view that on your own time here. And so I'm going to conclude this audio lecture right here, and we'll talk to you later.